We're going to continue our study in Ephesians and chapter 2, and we're going to start today with verses 1 to 3. And this section really talks about what we were like before Christ. Before we had encountered Jesus, what was our human condition like? And so verse 1 starts with this word and any of you English students will know that you shouldn't really start a sentence with and. But again, it's just this idea that it's a continuation. Paul is continuing on his thoughts from chapter 1. So in chapter 1 we flow nicely into chapter 2. And Paul's going to identify three conditions of the human state that existed before we come into Christ. The first is that we are dead. The second is that we are slaves, and I'll write this, so let me write dead. The second is that we are slaves, and the third down here is that we are condemned. And I'm going to explore these ideas as we go through the chapter. So how are we dead? Well, first of all, we were dead in our trespasses and our sins. We weren't just a bit unwell, we weren't a bit under the weather, we weren't critically ill, we weren't struggling or just in a mess. We were dead. We had no hope without Christ. And this is going to become really important as Paul unpacks this chapter because he goes on to say that even though we were dead, God still loved us. So how then are we slaves? Well, we weren't just dead, we were slaves. So we were following things. We were following, first of all, and I'm going to use A, B and C to try and make it less confusing. So we were slaves to the course of this world, by which Paul means culture. You know, we can look at our own culture and say, oh, it's increasingly becoming less Christian, it's becoming more materialistic, or it's becoming more selfish, it's becoming more revolving around the internet, and it's all terrible. But really, when we are outside of Christ, we will just drift with the culture. That's who we are outside of Jesus. We can't help but follow these things because we are slaves to the culture we live in. The second thing is that we are following the prince of the power of the air, by which Paul is saying you were slaves to the devil and his schemes and his lies. And outside of Christ, people are in many ways influenced and controlled by the devil because he is the ruler of this age, as we talked about in our last session. But we aren't just slaves to culture and the devil, we're also slaves to ourselves, to the passions of our flesh and the desires of our body and of our mind. Now, we all have fleshly desires, whether that's for food or for love or for sex or for pleasure of some kind or money, and all of those things are okay, and many of them are godly, but when those passions begin to drive us and control us, as Paul is saying, they essentially become a slave. We become slaves to ourselves. We become slaves to our flesh. And this is what we were like before we met Christ. And so really that leads us to the third sense of condition. So we were dead, we were slaves, and now we are condemned. We are by nature children of wrath. It's a genetic thing. You and I can't spell the word genetic there. Look, how do that? Genetic, there we are. So we are just born genetically into children of wrath. Now you could say, oh, well, you know, surely children are very lovely and innocent. Well, it's just the case that every single human being grows up and ends up becoming like these first three verses, like the rest of mankind. Everyone is like this, and it's a tragic state of affairs, really. And you might say, Tim, why have you just wasted all this time just depressing us this morning as we've looked at Ephesians chapter 2? Well, really, we're going to come on to the best bit of this chapter, and it's these words, but God. But God. I just think it's such a wonderful statement. Anything, if you're struggling in your life, you can always turn around and say, but God. But this is the big idea this morning I want us to think about. First of all, if we are to really worship God, we need to be thankful. people. We need to remember where we've come from. We are thankful for what we are saved from. We need to be thankful that God has saved us from our deadness, from our slavery, from our condemnation. Isn't that wonderful? But also we should be prayerful. We should be praying for those who are still dead in their sins, who are still slaves, who are still condemned, and asking God to open their eyes. And so as we just reflect on these scriptures this morning, I just want to encourage us to be joyful in remembering where we've come from and where God is taking us, and to pray for others that their eyes would truly be open to all that God has done for them.